They sold me to the king. The door shut behind me with a whisper too final to ignore. Velvet curtains smothered the windows. A single candle bled wax onto gold. In that silence, every scrape of my shoes sounded like betrayal. Liebel stood waiting, calm, precise, like a clerk reading out an inventory. His eyes slid past me, already on the next task. "This way," he murmured. And I obeyed, because disobedience had no place in Versailles. Only then did the weight strike me. The air was thick, sweet with burning wax, suffocating. The marble underfoot bit through my shoes with its chill. My stomach tightened until I thought I would collapse. And then I saw him. Louis, the beloved, the King of France. His gaze pinned me still. No words, no warmth. Just the heavy look of a man who had measured 100 girls before me and would measure 100 more. They called him the beloved. But in that room, under that stare, I learned what history would later name him. The most perverted king in history. I was not born for palaces. My father was a cloth cutter who died with debts. My mother worked her fingers raw at a workshop near Paris, stitching gowns she would never wear. We lived on scraps, on promises that tomorrow might be kinder. When a woman came to our door, speaking of service near Versailles, my mother's eyes lit up. "A chance," she whispered, pressing my hand as if opportunity had finally remembered us. I was given a new dress, a ribbon for my hair, and instructions that sounded less like advice and more like laws. Lower your eyes, never speak unless spoken to, smile if you are looked at. At the time, I knew little of kings. I only heard the songs, how France once adored him, called him le bien-aimé, the beloved. They said he had survived a fever that nearly killed him, and the people wept for joy. But by the time I came of age, that love had rotted. The 7 Years' War had drained the kingdom. Pamphlets mocked his court, and whispers spread that his appetites were stronger than his prayers. It was Madame de Pompadour, they said, who kept his throne steady. And when her warmth cooled, others were needed to fill the silence. Girls like me, recruited, housed in quiet townhouses near the palace, chosen not for titles, but for our ability to disappear. I told myself I was lucky to be noticed, lucky to be fed, clothed, promised a dowry. But luck is a blade with two edges. They promised discretion and a future. I did not know the price was my name. They called it La Petite Maison, the little house. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Shutters half closed, garden modest, a townhouse like any other in the Quartier Saint-Louis. But the moment I crossed the threshold, I understood. This was not a home. It was a waiting room for the king. The curtains were always drawn. The air carried the faint smell of starch and soap, as if scrubbing could erase what happened here. A maid instructed me in the rules. Wake at dawn, eat quietly, practice posture, read simple prayers aloud. But the most important lesson was silence. No questions, no laughter too loud, no memories of the life before. Even my name was taken. They gave me another, short, easy to pronounce, stripped of history. When I asked what had happened to the girls before me, the maid only tightened her lips. I noticed a ribbon left in a drawer, embroidered with initials that weren't mine, a ghost of someone erased. Then came Lebel, the king's valet. He entered with the calm precision of a man balancing accounts. His eyes scanned me as though I were livestock at market. He asked about my health, my family, my obedience. Every answer he recorded like an entry in a ledger. "You will be looked after," he said. "And after?" I dared to ask. He paused, then smoothed his cuffs. "After, you will be looked away." The words chilled me more than the stone floor. Days turned to weeks. Sometimes another girl would arrive, and for a short time, we would whisper at night, trading fragments of our pasts. But then she would vanish, taken in a carriage to Versailles, and never seen again. Once, I found a pair of shoes tucked under the bed, far too small for me. Proof she had existed, proof she had been forgotten. Then came my night. The carriage jolted through the dark, hooves echoing against cobblestone. The palace loomed ahead, glittering like a jewel set against black velvet sky. Yet the closer we drew, the more it resembled a trap. Inside, the halls blazed with gold and light, but they were empty, guarded by silence. No courtiers, no laughter, only shadows. I was guided past doors I dared not glance at. Each step echoed like judgment. And then, the chamber. Louis sat waiting. Not the myth, not the beloved, but a man drained by power, his eyes tired, his gestures rehearsed. He did not speak at first. He let the weight of the silence press upon me. When he finally looked up, it was not at me, but at what I represented. Youth, distraction, the promise of escape from the burdens of a failing kingdom. His hand brushed the air as if dismissing a servant. For a heartbeat, I thought he was dismissing me. Relief surged, then collapsed as the door shut behind us. That night was not passion. It was procedure, a transaction. He seemed less a man than a habit, repeating movements that had already emptied themselves of meaning. I felt not desired, but consumed, like wine poured into a cracked goblet, destined to spill away unnoticed. When it ended, a box was placed in my lap. Jewelry, coins, a promise of dowry. Payment for silence. Payment for youth. Payment for the theft of a self I could never recover. The next morning, back in the little house, I saw my reflection in the mirror. The girl staring back no longer carried the same name. She carried the mark of a machine that turned flesh into secrecy and secrecy into power. In the king's ledger of desire, everything had columns, and I was just another entry to be balanced. Pompadour's death changed everything. For years, she had been the king's balance, mistress, advisor, gatekeeper. With her gone, the careful machinery shuddered. Whispers crept through the corridors. The king was aging, restless, desperate. The petites maîtresses were no longer a secret whispered only by La Belle. They became rumors the whole court savored. Then came Jeanne Bécu, Madame du Barry. She was no shadow in a hidden townhouse. She was radiant, laughing, adorned with jewels, seated beside him in public. What we had endured in silence, she flaunted in gold, and the court turned on itself. Some adored her, others spat at her feet. But for us, the girls of the little house, her rise was our erasure. One by one, the townhouses emptied. A girl would be summoned, given a dowry, married off to a soldier or clerk, and vanished from the record. Not as women with names, but as expenses closed. I watched friends disappear into carriages under moonlight, each promising to write, none ever sending word. The ledgers were balanced, the memories erased. I too was summoned. "You will marry," Lebel said. "The king is generous." His voice was softer than usual, almost weary, but his eyes avoided mine. He knew what he was asking, not a choice, but a burial of identity. My wedding took place in haste. The church smelled of damp stone, the vows were mumbled, and the man beside me was a stranger who looked at me as if I were part of his new fortune. A new name was inked in the registry, blotting out the one I had been born with. Yet I could not escape the shadows of Versailles. Pamphlets, the libelles, flooded Paris, crude sketches of the king with nameless girls, accusations of vice, decadence, wrought at the heart of France. I read them in secret, heart-pounding, knowing that though the faces were caricatures, the truth behind them was my life. My body had been turned into propaganda, a weapon against the monarchy itself. And still within the palace, the king sat, his gaze hollow, his laughter mechanical, surrounded by courtiers who bowed by day and whispered by night. Once, passing through a corridor, I saw him again. For a moment, I thought he recognized me, but his eyes slid over me as if I were a chair, a wall, a servant he had never known. That was the final cruelty, to be consumed and then forgotten. They called him the beloved. They called him a monster. But for me, the worst truth was simpler. I had ceased to exist in his world long before France turned against him. They erased me so cleanly that even I forgot the sound of my first name. Years passed, and the world moved on without me. I lived in the provinces, in a town where no one spoke the name Versailles aloud, though its shadow stretched over every street. I was a wife, a mother, a woman with a name that was not mine. At market, I bartered for bread. At church, I knelt with the rest. To them, I was ordinary. To myself, I was a ghost wearing borrowed skin. News arrived slowly, carried by travelers and cheap pamphlets. They said the king had sickened. Smallpox, whispered one voice. Punishment, whispered another. They said he summoned Madame du Barry only to dismiss her before death, as if absolution could be bought in the act of rejection. When he died in 1774, they said bells rang, but not all were tolls of mourning. Some rang in relief. I read the libels again, those crude little books that had once terrified me. They mocked him, spat filth, exaggerated every whisper into a crime. But even in their poison, I recognized fragments of truth. My truth. The world had finally learned what had happened in secret rooms, though twisted into satire. He was remembered as perverse. We were not remembered at all. And that, I realized, was the true cruelty of history. The king's sins had a name. Louis XV. But the girls he used were nameless, faceless, reduced to ink stains and rumors, our bodies turned into paperwork, our stories into shadows. What lesson could I leave? That power without restraint devours not only the powerful, but those forced to orbit them. That when desire is turned into bureaucracy, entries in ledgers, houses hidden by curtains, the human soul is the first casualty. I learned to live again. I wrote my real name in the margins of a prayer book, a small rebellion against oblivion. I whispered it to my children, though they never knew why it mattered so much. History called him the beloved, then the perverted. I call him something else, the king who taught me that power can turn a body into paperwork and a life into silence.